Perfect. Lovely. So my name's Jenny. I am representing the Kickstart Gateway Sport and Activity Professionals on behalf of Mark Rasher, who unfortunately was unable to attend today. Our gateway is working on the Kickstart scheme, which means we're supporting employers to support young employees who are aged 16 to 24 and are in danger of long-term unemployment. And how we're doing this, it is a government scheme. It is fully funded for 25 hours a week for employers to provide training and support and work-based learning for young people to help them to get their first foot onto the work ladder. We are offering these webinars to support both our employers and our employees on this scheme. And I'd love to introduce you to Stuart Falconer, who is from Morgan Thomson HR. Stuart is going to be covering how HR supports the growth of your business in this latest webinar. And it's actually one of a set of 3 that Stuart has been kind enough to provide us. You can watch the recorded version of the previous one, which is now on our YouTube channel. And in about 3 or 4 weeks, we will be covering sickness absence also. So welcome, Stuart. It's lovely to have you with us. Stuart has got over 20 years experience in a variety of different human resources roles and across a number of sectors. And I'll hand you over to Stuart now, who will be able to give you a more detailed introduction.
Okay, afternoon, everyone. So it's a really good starting point, actually, to explain a bit about my history in HR, because hopefully that will explain a little bit about why HR and how HR can support the growth of your business. So I started in the public sector in a hospital 20 years ago, and that's where I learnt my trade. And for those of you who maybe don't know, when you work in the public sector, it's very much a bureaucratic organisation. And bureaucratic means process-driven. It's public money after all, so you have to be able to justify a lot of the decisions you make. So a big part of my learning was in an environment which had 3,000 members of staff. There was a HR department of about 20, which covered recruitment, learning and development. There was an industrial relations team and a compensation and benefits team as well. And so the whole of the HR function was very much a process-driven, bureaucratic. I'm not going to lie, it was a bit of a grind at times. You know, for example, if you wanted to discipline someone, it could take actually up to about 6 months to do so. Because if you suspended someone, you did an investigation, the rules around how you did an investigation were different in the public sector. And so literally it could take 6 months from the start of a process to the end of a process. But once I'd left the NHS and started working, I did a number of interim roles. And so for about 5 years, I did 6 months here, 6 months there in a variety of roles. And that was just an interesting experience in itself, because you realized in time, or I realized in time, is that HR fulfilled a very different function in each of these different sectors and these different industries. And I hadn't really considered that before. When you're in a business like the NHS and that's where you learn your trade, I sort of assumed to an extent that that would apply in other areas as well. But in fact, that's not the case. And that was never more so evident when I started to work in the private sector and worked for a couple of companies that were, you know, in the retail sector. And being in the retail sector, I learned again really quickly that actually HR fulfilled a very different role. And you didn't have to wait 6 months to have to discipline people. You could do it quite quickly. So that's the interesting context behind why HR is different in different sectors. And more importantly, how can HR support the growth of your business when there are so many different sectors to take into consideration? So having worked for myself having worked as an employee in all these different environments, I eventually started to work for myself about 10 years ago. So I started opening up my own business, and I provide HR support to SMEs, small and medium enterprises. And I learned really quite quickly as well, is that the majority of queries that I had from prospective and new clients were all about resolving a problem that occurred there and then. So very quickly, I realized that in my role as a HR consultant, as an independent HR consultant working for small businesses, I was actually a firefighter. I was resolving problems that had already occurred. And my technical skill is all around resolving those problems, making sure that you comply with law so that a business isn't at risk of being taken to a tribunal by an employee who feels that they've been either treated unfairly, and things like that, are discriminated against. So when I started to realize that the world of an SME was slightly different, and it might sound obvious to you guys, I don't know where you go, where you all work and the sizes of your business, but I wanted to sort of try and explain that because it is quite important then, because I realized that the majority of the clients that came to me were small businesses. They had no HR processes in place. I guess they saw it as a necessary evil to an extent because they didn't know how to deal with the problems. They needed someone to come in straight away and put out the fire. It made me a troubleshooter. But in time, the longer I started work for myself and the more I spent time working with small and medium-sized businesses, I started to realize that actually I wasn't really adding value. It's quite easy to resolve a problem. And when you've worked in HR as long as I have, like over 20 years ago, as Jenny mentioned, you become quite adept at resolving the problems. Let's be honest about it. You could put a pin in the directory and pick out 20 HR consultants, and we all know how to deal with someone. We all know how to discipline someone. We all know how to manage someone through a sickness process. We all know how to make people redundant. These are all the skills that you learn when you're on the job, and you can take those technical skills into most businesses. But the challenge really for me was trying to work out why a business didn't have the processes in place, and why couldn't they see that HR would be a value-added addition to their workforce, an addition to their structure that could actually support them in a more strategic context. I've lost count actually. In fact, I think probably 95% of all of my new clients, all of my prospective clients, have come to me because they had a problem with a member of staff. And the first question I'll ask the client is, okay, well, let's go through the history of this problem. How long has it been in existence for? And the chances are it's a problem that's occurred over a length of time, whether it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, a month, or in some cases, I've had people contact me and say they had a problem member of staff that's been on the books for 17 years. And of course, you can see then that if you've got a problem for 17 years, the structure isn't working. There isn't a HR structure to support the dealing of those sorts of situations. And so what are the consequences of not dealing with a problem? I mean, it's not rocket science, is it? But the problem is exacerbated. Staff then become very comfortable in their role because they feel that there are no consequences. And for those, well, I don't know if anybody watched the previous webinar that we did. I like to use these 3 words that if you've got a pen and paper, and I would urge you to write these down, because these 3 words are the mantra that I like to use with all of my clients when it comes to managing staff. And the 3 words are expectations, accountability, and Jenny, can you remember the third? You're on mute, so maybe your mute button.
I'm sorry, it would help if I wasn't on mute, wouldn't it? Explanation, accountability. I can't. I'm sorry.
You can't remember. It's consequences.
Yeah, sorry.
Consequences. So I want you guys to think about those 3 words for a minute and try and understand what they actually mean within the context of HR. So expectations, really simple. This is the job that I expect you to do. It's the job I hired you to do. It's the job I pay you to do. It's the job that I expect you to do like this. Simple, right? Accountability. It's your responsibility. You take responsibility for doing the job that we're paying you to do. If you can't do the job, if you can't do it for whatever reason, like you don't have the skill set, or you're unsure, you don't have the confidence, or you're just uncertain, come back to me. We'll discuss it again, and we'll make sure that we agree the expectations so that you know what it is that you're supposed to be doing. Accountability, take responsibility for it. But there's got to be a consequence, right? If you don't do the job we want you to do, there's got to be a consequence. If you don't do the job the way we want you to do it, the consequence might be that we end up disciplining you. Now, you might think that's like taking a stick, to a problem, but you don't have to discipline people. It's merely a reminder that this is the job that we want you to do. And here are the consequences if you don't do the job the way we want you to do it. But there can be positive consequences if you do the job the way we want you to do it. then you'll pass your probationary period. You may get a pay rise, you may get promoted if you do the job that we want you to do in line with the needs of the business. And people, you would be amazed. I mean, having worked in HR for 20 years, it never ceases to amaze me how many businesses don't understand that simple construct. I'll give you a couple of examples of how that can play out. So on my very first day in the NHS 20 years ago, on my very first day, I turned up, I was all excited, I was wearing my brand new suit, and guess what? I was the only person on time in the whole department. Out of 20 people, I was the only person on time. And about 9:05, my manager rushes down the corridor, papers flying everywhere. Stuart, great to see you. Delighted to have you on board. Come and sit down. Here's a handbook. Go and sit yourself over there, and I'll catch up with you this afternoon. And I swear, I sat there thinking, what on earth has just happened there? They weren't ready for me. I don't feel particularly important. They've just brushed me off and put me over there. And I feel like I've made a massive mistake in coming here. Years later, at the end of my employed career, I worked for a company and I was told about the job on the Monday. I was interviewed on the Tuesday. I was offered the job on the Wednesday. And on Thursday, on my doorstep was my contract and handbook. Wow. I started work the following Monday, and when I turned up for work, there was my desk. It had my passwords and login details over here. It had a copy of all the policies and procedures that were here. It had my business cards here. And more importantly, it had an induction checklist. It was a 2-week program of what I was going to be doing every minute of every day for the first 2 weeks without fail. Now, in the HR world, in that particular business, the HR department, I needed to have a conversation with payroll. I needed to make contact with the finance team. I needed to make contact with my operations team that I was going to be advising once I'd started work. I needed to meet the other members of the HR team. There were other key people in the business that I needed to be able to meet because that was who I was going to be dealing with in my day-to-day job. So that induction checklist was very, very important in me starting work for that company. And in my very first week in the job, I remember this because I was starting work as a senior HR advisor, and I had to take 4 members of staff into an adjoining room and tell them off. Why did I have to tell them off? Because they were late. How late were they? They were 8 minutes late. 2 of them were 4 minutes late, and the 4th one was 1 minute late. Now, this was my first week in the job, and I remember feeling incredibly uncomfortable at the principle of telling someone off for being 1 minute late. And when I told her, you can just imagine the look that she gave me, which was one of, you've got to be kidding me, right? I was 1 minute late. And I had to remind them, all of them, that actually when you work for this company, there is an expectation. That expectation is that you arrive at work 15 minutes before your shift starts. And in that 15 minutes, you can make yourself a cup of tea, you can go to the loo, take your coat off, have some breakfast if that's what you want to do. But when the clock strikes 9, I expect you at your desk with your headphones on, with your computer on, with your in tray clear, and you're good to go. That is the expectation. Take responsibility for it. But understand that if you don't want to do that, then you need to think about whether this is the right company for you. So that's a really clear example for me. Someone talking there. I can hear someone talking. Can you hear that, Jenny? No. So that's a really clear example of 2 different industries. You had the public sector, which didn't give 2 hoots about what time people turned up for work on. Now, what was the lesson that I took away from that? I didn't set my alarm. I wasn't as rushed in the morning to get to work on time because I knew there was no expectation about timekeeping in that particular hospital that I worked in at that time. You compare that to my last paid employment, you can see a severe contrast between the organisations. I'll ask you a question. I'll ask you, Jenny, if others aren't going to ask the questions, is which was the right one? Jenny?
Sorry. Yes. Sorry, I was just welcoming somebody into the chat. Yeah, it's always important to ensure that people feel really welcomed and individually, and that the individual feels that they're valued.
You're absolutely right, but I would suggest though that in those two examples of my first day in these new jobs, that neither was right or wrong, but it was right for that organisation. That organisation felt like timekeeping wasn't the most important thing in the world, whereas this organisation had timekeeping down as a very important thing to get right from day one. And what I learned in the second job is that I, as a manager, then set my alarm for half an hour early every morning, because I realised that there is no way on earth that I could tell people off or discipline people for being late if I didn't have the same attitude to timekeeping that they did. So you can see the two different examples there of how HR supported two very different organisations. And then you apply that to the SME world. And again, when I have a conversation with my clients about inductions, do you have an induction program in place? You would be amazed how many don't have an induction program in place for any new starters that join. And a lot of what I'm trying to encourage them to do is get going on the right foot, make people understand from the day they start that they're a very important member of the team. But what does it say when an employer doesn't have an induction program in place? How does that employee feel when they start work? How can they be made to feel welcome? So that's a little example of how, I'm actually not even going through the slides, am I?
Stuart, do you feel that because you made the point earlier that the two inductions were very much correct for the individual businesses, and I recently came across an induction where the induction pack was very much about health and safety, and less about the sort of softer, if you want to call it that, human resources side, because the business involved, health and safety was obviously of critical importance. They dealt with a very dangerous, they were working in a very dangerous environment. Do you feel that there should have been the softer one skills alongside, or do you still feel that was fair, that it was mostly human, it was mostly aimed at keeping the individuals safe at the expense of potentially
everything we're talking about today is around the needs of the business. So every business has its own set of priorities. When I think about my client list, so I've got about 30 or so retained clients, and I've got estate agents, I've got property management companies, I've got garages, I've got restaurants, I've got a pub. These industries are all different from each other, and it's up to each of those businesses to decide for themselves which is the best way that we can engage with our staff. I mean, even the way that those different industries are staffed is different, right? So you think about a restaurant and a pub, it's basically shift patterns and things like that. You may not get to work with certain people on certain days of the week. Estate agency is primarily a sales role. Well, especially the sales part, lettings less so, but you see you've got very much a sales environment. So the induction has to be tailored to each of those businesses. So certainly with one of my companies is a construction company. So they've got a very heavy health and safety element to their induction as well, because they're putting people into quite serious situations. And when you're working on a building site, you can imagine the dangers on site. So that's got to be a critical part of the induction. Whereas if you're working in an office, in a desk job, the induction is going to be a slightly different one, but it's got to be tailored to the needs of the business. And if the business owner doesn't have that information at his disposal, then I would suggest he contact someone like me and say, right, how can we create an induction? How can we create a structure? How can we create a HR infrastructure that supports all the things that we've just been talking about, including health and safety, including timekeeping, and so forth and so on. I'm just going to whiz through a few of these slides because I was conscious that as I was waffling away there that I wasn't going through the slides, but they pretty much reiterate all the things that we were talking about. When I was working with my small clients, a lot of what I'm doing is reacting to problems that are already occurring. And a lot of what I try and encourage my clients is to understand that if I'm reacting to something, that means you could have done something about it differently previously. You shouldn't really be dealing with me to react to a problem that's been in place for a number of weeks, months, years, whatever. And so by introducing expectations accountability and consequences, people could start from day one on the front foot, understanding exactly what's expected of them. And if you look at the NHS and you look at the private organisation I worked for, any employee could start working either of those businesses and choose which one they prefer to work in. So if you don't want to be stuck in an organisation that's really quite dictatorial with the timekeeping, then go and get another job, if that's not the way you want to do it. I know of one company in London, one of the big companies in London, that has a policy that says that we are going to terminate the bottom 10% performers of all staff. Now, you think about that as just a principle and think, is that reasonable? Well, they've set the expectations out, right? They've set the expectations to everybody, so everybody knows what they've got to do. You've got to perform. And if you don't perform, you run the risk of losing your job. You and I might not think that's particularly fair, but in that particular environment, obviously that's the way they feel is the best way to get the best performance out of all of their staff. So that would be a key thing for any small business owner to understand, dependent on the industry and dependent on their sector. How can we create a business model with a HR strategy and structure to support the needs of the business and support those goals? So that's the reactive HR part. So you can see, can't you, if you don't have these structures in place, if you don't have the expectations clearly communicated to the businesses, then you're running a risk. You're running a risk of those problems recurring. So again, it'd be interesting. I wish the guys in the room would be happy to sort of jump in with some questions, because I'd like to know what industries they work in, or put it in the chat room. If you talk about which industries you're in the chat room, then maybe I could use those as examples for how HR could support those particular industries.
I'll let you know what's in the chat box in a moment.
Okay. A lot of what I try and do with my clients, obviously by being proactive, or how can you be proactive? Well, being proactive is trying to trace back the root cause to the beginning of the problem, and try and find out how that problem could have been avoided right from the word go. And clearly it goes back to expectations, right? If people are continually making mistakes and not doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, then something somewhere is down to communication. And if they're not being communicated with effectively, you can't be surprised when people don't do the jobs that you expect them to do.
We have a response from Abigail. She works in banking and finance.
Is that a small business then, or a larger business? Abigail, if you wouldn't mind just adding that. I guess that's quite a large corporate business, right? Well, we could talk about the banking sector anyway as a profession. I've never worked in the bank within a HR function, but I would imagine, and I'm pretty certain that a bank would have a massive HR department, and that HR department's got to provide a service to thousands of employees over many different branches. And so the key thing there, I don't want to make the comparison, but I can't think of a better comparison to make. You look at something like McDonald's. Is it a large one?
It's not. It's a small business with less than 200 employees, Stuart.
Okay, but we'll use that as a principle then. When you think about something like McDonald's, and everybody understands McDonald's, and why do they understand McDonald's? Because they go into every single restaurant and they know exactly what they're going to get. You go into a McDonald's in London, go to McDonald's in America or China, whatever, and you ask for a Big Mac, and you get a Big Mac in exactly the same place everywhere. So the larger organizations will have a consistent approach to how HR supports all of those different branches or restaurants in the case of McDonald's. And with smaller businesses, certainly with my estate agents, I've got a few estate agents who have maybe 4 or 5 branches, and the same principle applies. How can we ensure, or how can that business ensure, that the experience of a client that goes into a branch in that region is the same as they go into a branch in another region? Of course, you're going to get some local differences and things like that, but you want there to be some consistency across the whole organization, so that the HR can then support the managers to deliver that same consistency across the whole organization. And I use timekeeping as I'm jumping forward here, but we use timekeeping as a good example of this, because if you set out the expectations for timekeeping, in other words, if you're late, we'll give you a warning. All right, let's just really keep it simple. How can you be sure that if one person is late in one business or one branch, how can you be sure that that person gets disciplined, and that someone in another branch who's also been late also gets disciplined? How can you ensure that consistency? Does that make sense, Jenny? Because the question is the same, but you've got a different set of, you've got different environments. So even though expectations, accountability and consequences, even though that applies to individuals, especially when they start work, and especially when they are being managed by a manager, more importantly, right, is what are the expectations of the business on as a whole? What are the expectations of the business regarding timekeeping right across the board? So you've got 3 branches or however many branches, you've got however many members of staff. How can we ensure that all of them are treated the same? Because you don't want to be disciplining one person over here for being late and then find out that someone else in another branch isn't being disciplined because he said, oh yeah, but the traffic was bad. That was the reason why I was late. And then the manager said, okay, well, I'll let you on. You've created an inconsistency there, and actually you've created a bit of conflict. If you see that, you create a bit of conflict now, because if the one member of staff finds out that someone wasn't disciplined for exactly the same offence that he's been disciplined for, you can see how you're going to create an inconsistent approach to HR across the whole organisation.
I've actually seen that within a single site where you've got very discrete departments, and we had a manager who was very keen on timekeeping and another manager who didn't mind, and so you did get the staff complaining about how person A had disciplined them for being 5 minutes late and person B had allowed someone to just roll in half an hour late but do half an hour, you know, on the end. And what wasn't always clear was that that person B's department was able to work effectively from 6 a.m. until 6 p.m. and could afford to have the flexibility, but the other department was the stores department, and it was open at 8 and it finished at 5, and it had a set of individuals who were going to go into the stores to collect stuff and come out again, and they had a set time in which they had to do it, so that the staffing had to be absolutely on point in the stores, and it didn't have to be in the other department. And I think that does cause huge issues.
It may well do, but then we go back to the expectations. Set out the expectations so that people understand that different departments work differently. I mean, having worked in the NHS, it's not, you know, if you think about it, I was working in the HR department as fundamentally an administrator. I was in an administrative role, but you had nurses. Nurses had, you know, would it have been still appropriate for them to turn up as late? No, of course not. That you know, that affects people's lives. And the interesting thing when working in the NHS, which is just it's a slightly, I'm going to digress a little bit. We used to keep a spreadsheet of all of the people that were being disciplined at any one time. So we could sort of like a tracker, so we could keep an idea about who was being disciplined and where. And it always amazed me that there was never any middle managers that were being disciplined. Because one of the difficulties about disciplining middle managers or even senior managers is the replacement. And you'd be amazed, you may not be amazed, I don't know, but it was amazing how many times managers could get away with incompetence because the consequence was having to replace them was harder than thinking, right, we'll actually tolerate this poor performing manager. And so what happens when you get a poor performing manager? Poor performance continues through that whole organization. And that's why I think when it comes to things like training, actually probably the most important thing is training for managers. I mean, I learnt my trade in the NHS, and you know, amazingly, when I learnt my trade, I ended up supporting managers. So let's take nurses as an example. I realized quite quickly that these nurses had spent their entire careers training to be nurses. They did 3 years, you know, training school at uni, and then they worked through the grade system. And then one day when the opportunity presented itself, someone said, well, you're now the manager. You don't get a say in it. You're just next in line. You're the top of your grade. So actually you are the person that's going to be the next manager. And that was common throughout the hospital, whether you're a radiographer, radiotherapist, a pharmacist, a pathologist. The reality is that you're next. And even though you don't necessarily don't have those skills, you're in that role. And so I realized in time that a big part of my job was to educate them, not only on the HR practices, but like you said earlier, some of those softer skills that they needed to understand. Because a lot of people, if they don't know how to be a manager, they can do it, they can become quite, and I'm generalizing here, could either be too nice because you don't want to discipline people. You could be too harsh because you don't want people answering back to you or challenging you. So you sometimes get these quandaries as to how to manage a staff situation. And staff will always try, where I say always, by and large, will try and do what they can do to get the job done with the least amount of effort. I know that's a generalization, but the point being is if a manager isn't on their case, making sure they do the job the way they're supposed to do it, they'll do what they need to do. And on the flip side of the coin, if you manage people with like an iron fist, you're going to create some resentment. You're going to create people that aren't happy coming to work because they know they're dealing with someone who's going to be quite harsh with them. But this slide here sort of talks about, what recurring issues do you face? I just mentioned timekeeping. Timekeeping's the most obvious one, really, isn't it? But you can think about in each of the industries of the people on the webinar. I'm hoping you could think back to your own organizations and try and work out what are the key problems that we've got. What is the consistent issues that we're continually having to deal with? And then if you can, try and work out by tracing back to a root cause, and then you can start thinking about what we can put in place to try and avoid those things from happening again. You have to be mindful, though, that the more severe the issues, then you're looking at a harder challenge. A quick example of how that could work out. So I worked for an organization once that was government funded, and they had to hit target every year in order to be sure that they'd get the funding the following year. And if they didn't hit target, they ran the risk of the funding not being renewed, which meant people would lose their jobs. And each of the workers who worked in the community, they were all underperforming. And when I came on board to try and get them to up their performance levels, the initial reaction I got from these people was one of contempt. Who am I? Who do you think you are, coming in here telling us how we should do our jobs? You don't know what it's like on the front. You've got no idea how hard it is. And I had to say, I, with the greatest of respect, it's not my business to know all those things. All I know is that you're underperforming, and you have to do X amount of work in order to make sure that the funding gets renewed next year. That's it. And out of the 10 caseworkers that I was advising upon, 8 of them got a first written warning. Out of those 8, 5 of them got a final written warning, and it was only when one person got sacked, when one person eventually lost his job because he didn't perform for the 3rd time in a row, and he lost his job, that only then did everybody else then start thinking, crikey, we now realize that our jobs are at risk. Stuart, what can we do to help? What can we do to do our jobs properly? Well, I asked you to do that 6 months ago. You didn't do it. So that's why I think it's useful for any organization that has recurring themes is to tackle them sooner rather than later. The longer you leave them, the harder it is. And that was an example of leaving a problem that it took a long time to get to that point. We had to go through an enormous amount of pain, really, to get to the point where people were starting to be working on the same page in line with the needs of the business. So have a think about those things. And so, yeah, when you think about those examples in your own workplace, have a think about how you can track it. I don't know. Timekeeping is an easy one. You can keep a record of when people arrive at work on time. I guess it's more challenging when certainly in different industries. Again, I don't know what the recurring issues might be in Abigail's business in finance. I don't know what those recurring issues would be. But if you want to tackle people's behavior or performance, then there has to be an audit trail of the things that they're doing wrong, so you can provide the justification for the changes you want to make. I hope that makes sense. Communication. There you go. I mean, I don't know. Whenever I traced back a problem in all of my 20 years in HR, I always tried to do an investigation that had 2 purposes to it. The first purpose was to investigate the incident itself. So timekeeping might be one, or underperformance, or you name it, fraud, theft. The first thing is to actually investigate what's happened. But the second part of the investigation should be to investigate what could have been done differently to avoid that situation from occurring. So there are 2 points to that investigation. And certainly in a lot of the investigations I've done, being as experienced as I am, and occasionally I'll do investigations in other clients, I've realized after a while that a lot of the problems that have occurred with regards to this incident could be traced back to a procedure flaw. or a process flaw where someone didn't know someone that's happening. And I worked in a housing association a number of years ago, and there was a risk to the business of about £500,000 as a consequence of fines, if I remember correctly. And so I was asked to participate in an investigation. And I remember quite clearly interviewing a few of the staff who were all told that their jobs were at risk, that this could be considered gross misconduct because of the level of the risk to the business. But I remember speaking to a few of the members of the staff when we were interviewing them, and it dawned on me quite quickly that actually all of the staff fell into one of three departments. And each of those three departments didn't know what the other departments were doing with regards to this process. So in a nutshell, the process starts here and it has a timeline and it goes through the three departments. And it just sounds weird, doesn't it? That those three departments didn't know what the others were doing. And so when this problem occurred, I was able to trace it back and realize that actually this was a procedural flaw. Obviously, that provides us with an opportunity to resolve the procedural flaw, rectify it, recommunicate what the new process is so that people understood and that all three departments were on the same page, avoiding the problem from recurring itself. That's why, again, you go back to those three buzzwords: expectations, accountability, and consequences. Simple, right?
Would that have been helped if there'd been regular meetings? Because when you've got any organisation where departments are very much in silos, did you feel that would have been something that would have helped?
Definitely. But if you think back to a strategic point I'll give to you here. So when I did my master's in HR, I just thought I'd drop that into the conversation. When I did my master's in HR, one of the modules that we did was on HR strategy and how it supported the business plan. I was lucky that I was doing my master's when I was at the NHS. So I had access to some incredibly strategic documents, and the business plan was a rolling 3-year plan, which meant that every year it was renewed. So every year it was a rolling 3-year plan, and the HR strategy evolved every year to meet the changing needs of the business plan. And you think, well, I'll give you an example. The business plan identified the fact that there was a shortage of pathologists. So within the pathology department, you had biochemists, you had microbiologists, and a couple of others who I forget. And the majority of the age of the people in the senior positions was over 50. And so the business plan had identified that there was going to be a succession plan at some point in the future, right? And so therefore the HR strategy then addressed that particular issue and made it a goal for the recruitment department to work out a plan for how we were going to encourage more people into the profession of pathology, so that you could then create a succession plan. So you could see how the goals from the business then feeds through the various departments. So therefore you're creating the goals for departments, and the goals of the departments then become the goals of individuals. So meetings would be an excellent way of ensuring that consistency applies all the way through the organization, and that every month you have a meeting, and every month that meeting should have a regular agenda with the same topics up for discussion every single year, so every single month. And we'll use that recruitment as an example. So the senior team meet once a month and they say, right, we've identified the fact that we've got a problem in the pathology department. What's the action here? Okay, well, the action is going to be for the pathology department to create a plan for how they're going to encourage more people into that profession. We're also going to ask the recruitment department to work with the pathology department to work out what they need to do in order to be able to advertise and recruit people into these new roles. So now you've got a strategy. So now you've got to feed through the strategy. So now the HR department and the pathology department have a meeting to discuss how they're going to work together. The pathology department then might have individual meetings with individuals, because I just mentioned two particular job roles: microbiologists, biochemists. So someone in microbiology, it's your job. What I want you to do is to draft a strategy for microbiology, and I want you to construct a plan for biochemists, and then that can then be fed back every month as to the progress. Simple, right? So you've got a flow of information right the way through the organization. This page here that talks about the shared values, directors are the ones, the leaders of the business, the senior leadership team, right at the top of the tree, they set the agenda. That's got to be communicated all the way through the different levels of the organization. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to managing staff, what you don't want anybody to turn around at any point, any staff member or anybody employed by the company, you never want them to turn around and say, but I didn't know that. Because that poses a question. Well, why didn't you know that? Who is responsible for making sure that you knew that information? So that's why you cascade the values, you cascade the expectations through the business so that people are all engaged on the same page as to what it is that they're supposed to be doing. It sounds simple, I appreciate that. So I guess, you know, again, with the participants in the room or our listeners, is to have a think about your own organization and try and work out how can we create a communication plan or a communication strategy that allows us to share those common values that we have, that we hold dear in this business. How can we make sure that we cascade it through the business so that everybody is as proud as working for us as the next man, so that Dave over there in finance feels equally as proud towards the business. He knows what he's contributing towards in the same way that Jane does over there in, you know, in marketing or in operations. Every individual business has to make that assessment at some point to understand how that all interlinks with each other. And I think I used this example last week, Jenny, didn't I? When I said, if you can imagine a big circle, and that circle in the middle is operations. That's operations. That's the technicalities of the business that you operate in. But outside that circle, you've got a lot of little circles all around the outside. And each of those circles, one is HR, one is health and safety, one might be finance, payroll, marketing, advertising, sales, you name it. Some of those might be within operations, but by and large, the majority of those are called support departments, back office departments, and their job is to support operations. That's the reality of it. And so how do they communicate with each other? Because if HR's job is to give operations all of the tools that they need to be able to do their job properly, there has to be information coming back, which we use, therefore, to monitor the success of the work they're supposed to be doing. It's got to be a two-way street. What's next? Well, I've just sort of talked about that. Look at that. I even said what I did without looking at the slides. You know, I've given a few examples there, you know, and I could literally sit here all day and give you examples of how organizations struggle without that sort of top-down approach or without that understanding of how HR can support the business and the structure. You know, I had a client once that was managed by two brothers. They inherited the business when their father passed away, you know, and I like these guys. They're great, but they don't get on. They don't get on, all right? And they're chalk and cheese. And so they literally are running separate parts of the business, you know, without any communication with the other. And you wonder how that affects morale, right? You wonder how that affects the overall coherence of the team and its effectiveness of working together. And I asked them once, how do you make decisions? They don't. He makes decisions for his department and he makes decisions for his department. And you start to wonder how they could possibly plan for the future without sitting down together and working out what the HR strategy is or what the business plan is for the business going forward, because they never agree on anything. And this is, I know I shouldn't maybe be sharing this, but one of the funniest things that happened is that when I went into there to see them once, and these guys are in their 50s, maybe even their 60s. And one of the guys said to me, or I said, why am I here? Why have you asked me here? He goes, he'll tell you. And he goes, no. You tell him. You invited him. You tell him. No. I mean, that's just childish, right? These are the people at the top end of the business. They're the ones who own the business. And they're the ones that are, you know, unable to, you know, set a standard for the rest of the business to comply with.
Did you also find there were issues with employees playing one department off or one manager off against the other as well?
All the time. I find it really difficult at times to talk about my experiences because people would think that I just live in a quagmire of chaos. All right. And to be fair, the amount of examples I've got, yeah, you do. You see everything. I've seen it all. I've seen it all. And I realized in time that, you know, when I was an employee, I was just literally resolving these problems all the time because that was my job. But to add value to my clients now, how can we avoid these things from happening? So if people are playing people off against each other, there's got to be a root cause to that. And I've had it a few times where, for example, a staff member reports to maybe two managers because there are two different aspects to his job. So you've already got a slight problem there in a way, because who is responsible? Who takes ultimate responsibility for the management of that individual when he's being managed by this person when he does this job, and this bit when he's this person when he's managing this job? That would be an interesting example. You know, departments that play off against each other. There's a bit of a power struggle there. The directors have got to pull their fingers out, work together, set a standard, set out the expectations for how people need to communicate with each other. You know, one of my clients I'm working with at the moment, they've asked me to chair some of their managers' meetings. And my entire objective behind doing that is to consistent, is that the right word? Make the agenda items consistent, is to have the same topic on the agenda every single month. And every month we'll go over the same points every single time until it's drilled into their psyche. So they all know what to expect. So first thing on the agenda, finance. Let's talk about finance. Let's talk about the projections. Let's talk about what you've attained. And let's talk about what you're going to do in the next month going forward, right? That will be an agenda item. HR will be the next one. Let's talk about timekeeping. Who's been late? How many people have been late? What have you done about it? You're the manager. You're responsible for dealing with it. And have those regular agenda items so that any issues that crop up, we can agree an action point in that meeting that then gets documented, diarised, action points, which again is expectations, accountability, and consequences. You're the manager. I expect you to do this. Go and do it. If you don't do it, there may be a consequence. I feel like I'm just going to say that the whole way through the rest of my presentation, Jenny. One of the interesting things, which I think I might have mentioned to you before, Jenny, is that a lot of my clients, when they first start work, are a startup business. And as a startup business, it's all hands to the pump. It's a bit chaotic. They're sort of going into the unknown to an extent. They don't really know what they're doing. I'm generalizing again, but that all hands to the pump approach, we're all on the same page. We're all trying to get this business to a point. And those startup businesses will do so by hook or by crook. I remember one of my clients, you know, they explained to me that when they first started, they were working long hours. Everybody was happy to work long into the evenings. They'd get pizzas in, you know, they'd head off down the pub afterwards, and they create a fantastic team ethic. And everybody felt like they were part of something really special. But at some point, that's unsustainable, right? Once you've reached a point in the future, whenever that point would be, you can't keep having that same attitude to the business going forward. Any new member of staff joining that business is told, oh, it's a 40-hour week, but we expect you to work until 9, you eat pizzas in the office, and we'll go to the pub afterwards. You can't do that. People have got lives. So there comes a point where the business will make a transition from the startup into a business with a future. It's been sustainable for a few years now. You've now got to introduce the structure. You've got to introduce the policies, the procedures, the HR handbook. Assume you've got all the contracts in place. Now you can start to set the expectations for the business. Now you can start to set the values for the business. What are the values? How can you now make sure that all of the staff are on the same page moving forward? And it's sad with a couple of my clients that a lot of the staff that were involved in the startup of the business are no longer with those companies, because they worked best under the pressure of starting up the business. But then once the order of the business had become sort of part and parcel of day-to-day life, and there wasn't that same buzz and excitement of the startup, some of the staff couldn't operate within that structure. That wasn't their thing. So they had to move on. So there's now a very different workforce in place now than what it was when they first started. But that's got to be driven by the top, right? Setting those expectations, helping people understand what you're joining, what is the company you're joining, and why do we want you to join our company?
The senior leadership team changed too in that circumstance.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, in fact,
their view and how they manage the it's not just about what happens in the office and the pizzas until 9 o'clock. That they have to change their mindset to manage the business in a different way.
Absolutely. And I remember, and I'm really pleased you mentioned that, because one of the fallouts from that particular scenario with that particular client is one of the managers went on maternity leave. Now, you may know this, I don't know if everybody knows this, but if you go on maternity leave, you're entitled to come back to the same job if you come back within 6 months. If you come back after 6 months maternity leave, you're not entitled to the same job, you're entitled to a similar job. And in this particular industry, the woman wanted to come back to work, and she came back after, I think, 12 months, and she wanted to come back to her original job. The business had moved on. You know, the owner didn't want her in that particular role anymore, but had another role which was exactly the same, but just in a different location. That was it, a different location. And the employee was you know, very upset by that, and felt like, well, no, I've been here since, you know, day dot. That's my team. You know, you owe me. You know, I've been loyal to you for all that time, and yet you're taking away the team that I built up. But the business had made a decision that actually the needs of the business come first, and we think right now it's much better for you to be in that branch there. That serves our needs as well, and we would expect you to go and do that job to the best of your ability. Do you know what I mean? So there was a fallout, and you do get fallouts at times. But what amazes me more often than not is you get a lot of fallout when the owners of the business and the directors don't really hold their managers accountable. You know, you're the manager, get on with the job that you're doing. But actually, I can tell you now, Jenny, I can count on one hand the amount of managers that I've met as a HR consultant or as a HR employee who I'd say are top-notch, proper managers, people that understand their role from a technical point of view, they understand it from a softer skills point of view, they understand the elements of HR that allows them to do their job properly, they understand health and safety, they understand finance, budgeting. They're proper managers that understand the whole nuance of that role. In 20 years of working in HR, I can count on the fingers of one hand managers that tick every single box about being a good manager, because most of the people that become managers are promoted for the wrong reasons. They're promoted because they're next in line, or, you know, they've been there the longest, you know, or whatever. I'm not saying always, but it's not uncommon. And actually, if I think about it, that's probably the reason why I exist as a HR consultant, is the amount of clients that phone me and need some advice about how to manage an employee. And that would be because the managers don't have that skill set. So a lot of what I try and do right now with my clients is to educate the managers as to how to manage, or how to use HR to allow them to get the job done that they want to get done. That's a long way of answering your question. Right, where are we up to now? So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've got any examples, Jenny, of when you think back to your paid employment. I'm thinking about, you know, where the board of directors or the senior leadership team in all of my organisations have successfully driven change. You know, you know, I have to say the NHS was probably the best one, because it was public money. You know, because it was public funding. You know, they had to be accountable. And I'll tell you a brief story about the NHS back in the day. So when I worked in the NHS, you know, we're talking about 20 odd years ago, the Department of Health used to write a cheque every year to cover the overspend. So for those of you that don't know, an overspend would be, for example, you budget for 100 pacemakers, but then a patient, or the 101st patient, also needs a pacemaker. You have to buy the pacemaker. That therefore technically is an overspend. And so every year, the Department of Health would write a cheque to cover that overspend. And on one particular year, they turned around and said, we're not doing that anymore, you know, because the overspend, if I remember correctly, was around £10 million. You know, so, you know, how do you, if you're not going to write a cheque for £10 million to cover the overspend, well, what happens next? Well, the hospital itself had to then find £10 million. How do you find £10 million? Well, they had to reconfigure their services. They had to find savings in the business. But more importantly, they also had to find a way of running the business so it didn't have a £10 million overspend. So they had to become more accountable for the way that they managed their departments and how they actually made those savings and still delivered the service that they were supposed to. And so that particular hospital that I worked in set up what was referred to as a turnaround team. which was made up of someone from HR, someone from finance. They created a little project team, and their job was to go around the entire hospital, working with individual departments to work out how they could make a 10% saving on the way they ran their business. And so you can see there how it started at the top. They then set aside a project team, or delegated a project team with its own manager, and then gave them the task of actually addressing each of these different departments. So that was a really good example of how it worked, and then it worked.
Yeah, I did. I had a similar one. It was perhaps on a smaller scale. I worked also for a public sector organisation, but well, they were our main and only client, and I actually worked for a private sector organisation that was supporting them, and the client needed to make savings, which then cascaded down to us needing to make savings, which then cascaded down to my team needing to make a 33% saving.
Wow.
And my submission was that I should have half an extra person, i.e. a part-time person who would be peripatetic and move around my team of 13, and that half-time person would be able to support it. That was rejected because it was too expensive. So I then had to go back in and make 33% savings within my team of 13. And I actually achieved it by pairing I had two sides of the team, and one side I couldn't change because the client wouldn't let me, and the other side I was able to do. And I paired my teams up so that I had somebody that was really good at A and somebody else who was really good at B but pretty crap at A. And the pair of them would be paired up, and they supported each other. They were at opposite ends of the training spectrum, because we had two training intakes a year, one in December and one in August, and I had them paired so that they had I had them August and December, they were paired. So the first 3 months were always really busy for any of them. So the paired person would be quiet at that point, and the two of them worked together on the initial setup of the intake, so that it actually saved the 33% just doing that, because I didn't have to have one person trying to do extra overtime to complete all of those tasks individually. They all had a dedicated second person who could assist them with that, and just doing that one thing successfully drove the saving. But it also had an impact on the team, because then they drew together and became a better and more effective team. And it was quite obvious, because I had one half of the team that hadn't done that and the other half of the team that had. And it was really clear that the team that had been forced almost to work together became a better and more effective, cohesive team. And they would come up with ideas and come to me with things to say, I think we can do this better. Yeah. The other team came to me and said, this is all crap. I don't like it. I'm going to resign. Because they, and it just that one little change made a huge difference. Yeah. To how the team saw each other, because they had they'd been given the responsibility to assist each other, and I trusted them with the information of what we're trying to achieve here and what we've got to achieve. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great example. You know, if you think back again to when we started the webinar, every business is different. It has its own nuances, its own challenges, and it's got to be up to the owners of the business and the strategic people at the top end, the SLT, to work out how to deliver the objectives. It sounds like I'm sprouting the obvious, but you would be amazed. Or listen, I could sit here all day and tell you all the examples I've got of how that hasn't happened in practice. But there's always a solution, and it has to start with good communication. But I think I'd like to know where everybody else works, but maybe that's another conversation for another day. So what I wanted to talk about here really is how, I mean, at the end of the day, change is inevitable, right? Change is always going to happen. It would be naive to think that change doesn't occur to all of us at various times, not just in our personal life, but in work life as well. And a lot of what I'm doing with a couple of my clients at the moment is trying to establish, and there's a reason for it, is what do the actual staff think about their job? What are they actually going through right now? And I'm really excited to do it, actually, because the questionnaire, there's going to be a survey, which is literally going to be, what do you think about this? Do you agree, strongly disagree, and disagree, etc., etc. And you can only really chart the responses by graph. You know, you can make some assumptions and you can draw some conclusions from that type of survey. But I've also got an opportunity to go in and meet the teams as well, and get some confidential feedback on what their gut feeling is right at the bottom end of the business. Try and find out what it's like at the coalface, and to get that sort of feedback will give the company an excellent idea of understanding where some of the challenges that they face moving forward, because their business needs to evolve. And they have an interesting workforce, because they've got half their workforce that are based in office and the other half that are based out on sites. And so with the pandemic, right, clearly with the pandemic, that's changed the way that business has been able to work over the last 12 months to 18 months. And so a big part of this this questionnaire and this exercise is to try and establish what some of the issues are that a lot of the employees are feeling are feeling in the workplace right now. And hopefully that will then draw out some key areas, and then the business can address those key areas as and how they see fit, by creating a plan, by creating a strategy, by creating a business plan and a HR strategy to support that business plan, or support the development of the business plan. So that's the first stage, is to get that feedback. So where you get that feedback, sorry, maybe I'm waffling a bit here. I'll try and explain what I mean here. Is for a business to change, for a business to try and introduce new ways of working, there has to be a way of finding out what needs to be changed. And you can either do it through the investigations, as we said before. If you've got a recurring problem, what are you going to do about that? You're going to investigate it and try and trace back to the root cause to try and find out what the original problems are. And the second way of doing it is to actually do this, which is to do questionnaires and surveys and ask people themselves directly what are the issues at the bottom end, so we can try and find out where some of the blockages are, and we can try and address them that way. And then clearly, well, I say clearly, I keep saying these I say clearly as if it's the most obvious thing in the world. I don't know if it is, but if you've got an idea about what needs to change, and you can see why those things need to change, I guess part of the question would be, well, why has that been allowed to happen? What was the problems in the first place that created the environment that allowed those problems to exist in the first place? And so how does the current HR function support that? Or how has it been supporting? I gave you an example, I gave examples right at the beginning, how the HR department that supports a hospital is going to behave very differently to a HR department that supports an estate agent. The HR department is going to be different to one that supports the garage, or supports the web designer, or supports the restaurant or the pub. HR supports these businesses in very different ways. And so if you get the feedback about what's not working well, part of that should also be involved about, well, why was it not picked up sooner? How is it we're only finding this out now? Why don't we do a survey more regularly? Why don't we do these exercises on a more regular basis, so that we've got a better way of finding out before these things happen? And that's about staff engagement. How do we engage with the staff in order to ensure that these problems are picked up much sooner than they are further down the line when it becomes a bigger problem? I'm sort of talking myself out of a job in a way, aren't I? Making it happen. I mean, how can you make so let's just talk it through. So let's just say, for argument's sake, we've got some feedback on the business that's not working quite well. We've got that either from questionnaires, either from surveys, or we've got it because we've had some repeat problems in the workplace with regards to underperforming staff. There are some consistent things that are not quite working out. So now we've got that, what can we do to change it? How do we change those things to the best? Well, it has to start at the top, doesn't it? It starts from the top, making sure that the senior team have a shared vision. And I find that quite interesting in a way. Like the two brothers, you had two people at the top end of the tree. Well, how do they make decisions? Who has the casting vote? And I'd be interested to know I mean, again, with a lot of my businesses as well, is I ask them a key question, is at the top end of the business, how do you make a decision? Who decides? Because if you've got, say, 5 directors, or on the board of directors, and you've got 5 people there, is it a majority rule vote? So if you want to make a change, you want to do something, do 3 of you have to vote for it and 2 not? That's all very well. And if that's what happens, then that's what happens. But what's got to be crystal clear, though, is that the 2 people that didn't vote for it, they've got to buy into it, even though they didn't agree with it. So if 3 say yes and 2 say no, those 2 that said no have to just suck it up. You've got to suck it up and become part of the 3. So now you're a 5. You 5 are in agreement. So don't be going out back into your teams and saying, well, I didn't vote for it, but we've got to do it anyway. You're not going to get the right reaction to that. You've got to buy into it. And so that's where the leadership comes in. The leadership have got to actually agree how this is going to happen, and they're all on the same page. And this exercise I'm doing with my client right now, I've tried to make that very clear to them. If we've got a survey that's going out, we want to make sure that people are actually doing the survey, because what we don't want to have happen, I think there's about 80 members of staff in this business, so I don't want to sort of turn up the day after it's supposed to finish and realize I've got 3 surveys, all right, and that 77 people haven't bothered doing it. We think, well, let's start with the leadership team, right? Leadership team, speak to your managers, tell your managers that it's critical, it's vital that people fill in the survey. It's all anonymous, so just fill it in and help us make some changes that would improve the business. And if the managers are held accountable for it, they can then go up to the staff and say, oh, Dave, don't forget to do your survey. I'll give you 5 minutes at the end of the day or 5 minutes before your shift starts. Don't forget to do the survey. Let's get 80 results. But I don't have a fear of this company, but I can see in some companies, if they don't buy into this exercise, they're not going to chase up the managers to do the surveys, are they? Why would they? If they're not that bothered about it, it may not happen. So leadership have to work together and be accountable themselves. Communication, I mean, we've talked about this a couple of times now. I'm always interested in how communication occurs from business. And I think I gave an example about how the agenda of the directors' meeting should feed into the director of the next line down. The director of that next line down, the managers' meetings, those should feed into the one-to-ones they have with their staff. There's got to be that flow of information through the business. So meetings, in theory, should be diarised to happen in a chronological order. Directors meeting first, they set the action points. Those action points are then given to the next line of managers and said, right, these are your jobs, this is what you need to do. That then gets fed down individuals in the one-to-ones and said, right, your job is to do this. It doesn't have to be one-to-ones, it could be team meetings as well. But the point being is that you flow that information through so that staff know what are those 3 words again? I can hear everybody chanting them: expectations, accountability, and
consequences.
Consequences. Absolutely. Those are the 3 words, and you can apply them in any situation. If you can apply those situations to the business as on a whole, then you can apply it to individuals, you can apply it to teams. It's that simple.
Do you feel, though, that sometimes the information that's cascaded down from the top is not always as detailed as it might be, and therefore when it gets to the bottom, there's a feeling that it's not really, they've not been fully trusted with the information that they need to be able to help to achieve the objective that the management team are trying to achieve?
I've seen it all, honestly. I sound like I know it all. I don't know it all. What I can tell you, though, is that my experience in different businesses and different sizes of business has introduced me to different structures. And those different structures all operate in a slightly different way. And it's therefore up to the senior leadership team to create a structure and an environment where that information is fed through and it is accurate, effective, and people know exactly. And like I said, the amount of times, because, I'll digress a little bit. When I worked in the NHS, it wasn't uncommon to bump into a senior manager when walking down a corridor, and they would say something in passing, oh, don't forget to do this, or don't forget to do that. Well, that's not part of a full meeting. That's informal. So I've got to take that information and run with it. And if I haven't, it's entirely possible that that request that's been made of me impacts someone else. It's possible, not impossible, it's possible. So how does that then get absorbed into my day-to-day work and the work that I'm actually doing? That shouldn't really happen, but it does happen. I don't know an organization where you don't have corridor conversations, and that's all very well, but you'd like to think that those corridor conversations are happening within a function, within a process. So it's not just, oh, by the way, don't forget to speak to Dave. Well, no, Dave isn't your employee. He's your manager. So you should speak to him. Go and speak to him. I'll give you another good example, actually. With a lot of my owner-led businesses, because it's their business, they're the ones that have invested their life into this business. it's not uncommon for them to undermine managers sometimes by going directly to an employee and speaking directly to the employee. Now, the employee now thinks, well, who is my manager? Is it my manager or is it the owner of the business? Now, in that case, I would suggest 99 times out of 100, the employee will believe that the owner is the person he is accountable to, that he is the one that he's got to please. And therefore, the manager now becomes almost redundant in a way because he's not actually managing the employee because he's been undermined. And does the manager then confront the owner and say, look, mate, you just did my job for me. Now you either want me to do the job or you're going to do it yourself. But most managers, I would suggest under those circumstances, for fear of their job or to protect their job, will allow that type of behavior to exist. So under those circumstances, and even with things like, I've seen it as well when we're trying to introduce these changes and try and introduce expectations into the business to say, right, you do this, you do this, you do that, da, 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 da. Be mindful as well that someone might come to you and say, oh, look, he's asked me to do something. And I think under those circumstances, you send them back to the manager. Yeah, it's got to be the line manager who's responsible for the communication to their staff. It can't be someone else's responsibility. So in those cases, you send them back and say, look, I can't answer that question for you, or I could, but actually I'd rather you go and speak to your manager. And if your manager doesn't know the answer, your manager will speak to me. I'll tell your manager the answer, and then he can tell you. There's the chain of command, rather than cutting corners and giving information, through a side door. How much longer have we got?
Sorry, about 20 minutes. Sorry, my mute wouldn't come off.
So, when you look at the totality of what we've been talking about so far in this webinar, and you look about L&D and how it evolves or how it integrates into the business, it should be a fundamental part of the business to try and educate people, to give them these skills and understand about how to have these conversations, not just in the way that they manage the operation side of things. So, operationally, I expect all my managers to understand what it is that they're doing. That's not the issue here. Estate agents or restaurants or web designers or garages or whatever, people get promoted because they know the technicalities of the job. That's got to be a given. That's the first thing on the list, right? And if you look at a job description, the first parts of job descriptions are essential criteria. And those essential criteria are all operational. These are the things that you need to be able to learn or do in order to be able to do your job. And then underneath that, you've got a whole new set of skills that managers need to learn as well, which is around the softer skills, how to hold a team meeting, time management, how to manage a member of staff, how to have a difficult conversation, how to motivate people, how to get the staff to do what you want them to do, how to get staff to do a job they don't want to do, how to get staff to prioritize better, how to get staff to come to you when they've got a problem. Because if an employee's got a problem, they could be dealing with a bereavement or whatever. How can you know for certain that employee is going to come to you as their manager and tell you something that's quite personal and get an appropriate amount of support from you? If you don't know how to react to that, why would a member of staff come to you in the first place? So those are all the skills that you would like to think are part and parcel of the L&D of certainly managers to start with, and actually the directors as well. I mean, Jenny, would you be surprised? I don't know. I have done coaching of managers for some of my clients, and I've said to the owners, you need to be in that coaching. You need to be in that coaching because you need to know what it is I'm coaching your managers to say and do. That's got to be what you hold them accountable for. So if the expectation is that they do X, Y, and Z when they're managing a member of staff, the expectation for you as the owner of the business is to manage your managers by using X, Y, and Z. How can you hold them accountable for doing a job if you don't know what it is I'm asking them to do?
I think coaching is important at every level, actually, including at the lower level where if the business can afford and sustain it. I think coaching at the lower levels so that the individuals understand how they fit into the business and learn the skills to support management, because that is then going to allow them to build on that to gain the skills to become managers themselves, if that's what they're aiming to do. And I think that starting the coaching from the start makes it an accepted part of your career journey, so that it becomes comfortable as you move further up the ladder. I think you become better at being coached, because you ask more, you understand the process better.
Well, my business evolved recently, so just sort of briefly talk about my business. Although I'm a HR professional, did I mention I did my master's? Yeah, I think I did. Yeah. So my business is providing HR support, but over time, the amount of time I spent in the SME marketplace working with small businesses, I realized that a big part of my role as well is providing access to additional services. And it's those additional services that can prevent HR from being needed in the same level as it was before. And two of those things, one is the coaching, the L&D, is trying to support managers by giving them coaching on how to manage their role better, I guess. How to lead by example, how to handle staff. Those are all softer skills that I can do the technical stuff. I mean, my first webinar with you guys was conduct B capability, right? A completely dull, dry topic. Actually, it's quite interesting when you get into the nitty gritty, but the technicalities of HR can be quite dull. Let's be honest about it. Letter writing, you've got to comply with certain legislation, so it could be quite a difficult subject to get to engage with people unless you're that way inclined. But that's what I do. That's my job, is to talk about the technicalities of HR. But actually, I realize, or for a while now, is the softer skills that people need work with, is to how to have that human element to it, to make them approachable, so that staff can also come up to them as well. And so what we try and do is obviously provide a sort of program for staff as well. So, prioritizing, time management, delegating. These are all skill sets that people would benefit from knowing how to do it, how to coach. If you've never done it before, why do we think that they all of a sudden would become expert at it? It can't work that way. And also the interesting thing about L&D as well, and I'd like to talk specifically about well-being, because we've just coming, to the back end of a lockdown, that has been in place for what, 18 months? I mean, we've all been through the mill. I don't know anybody that hasn't suffered at some point because of the pandemic, whether it was meeting relatives, whether it was, meeting friends. Me personally, I live and work on my own, so I found it quite isolating, and I found my mental health suffering as a result, because I didn't have any people to speak to, or couldn't go and meet people. That's got to be the same for most businesses anyway. And how can we be sure that managers know how to have these conversations with staff who have all got their own individual challenges in dealing with the pandemic? Whether they know someone that's had COVID, whether they've known someone that's died, whether they've known people that have been holed up on their own. I'm of a certain age, I can sort of to an extent manage it. But what about the youngsters of our generation, or the youngsters of today's generation, who have been denied a social life? I don't know about you, Jenny, but when I was, a teenager, I had a life that involved going out and meeting my friends. They've been denied that. They've had to stay indoors with their families. I don't know how they've coped with that. So employers, I hope, are realizing that their well-being of their staff, if they can manage the well-being of their staff by providing the L&D, you'd like to think that the staff would be employees for a very long time, because they feel supported, they feel important, and they feel they've got a future role to play with that employer. My dad, for example, he was part of a generation that worked with companies for like 20 years, like Jobs for Life and things like that. I don't think that applies in the same way these days that it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. But if it doesn't apply in the same way as today, then that's got to form part of your strategy as well, hasn't it? If you've got to accept in a way that you're going to have a turnover of staff, because we can only train them so much, we can only give them so much development. Staff or employees tend to want one of two things: more money or personal development. There is a third argument, isn't there, that some people are just happy to come in, do their work and go home. And there are places for those people in the workforce as well. But you won't move forward with just those people You need people who are prepared to work that little bit extra, either for more money or for the development, their personal development. So that's got to be a key part of a strategy. Otherwise, 2 or 3 years time, you get people leaving because they can't see the future for them. They can't see what they're learning or where else they're going to go. Right, I'm waffling on. Data, know your business. You know, if you think about things like, you know, timekeeping and sickness absence, you can record that information. You can record the statistics behind it, and then you can use that information with which to influence the decisions you make. It's simple. I don't know, you know, different industry. I mean, the sales industry is quite easy in a way because you measure sales. You measure how many you've sold from week, month to the year. Then you can hold people accountable for hitting targets. I don't know. Each industry is different. I'm interested in the banking sector about how they would, you know, how do they measure performance? How do they assess? How do they measure? Don't know. I know for a garage, for example, and the websites are fairly similar, believe it or not, is that the garage and the website people bill time. So when a client comes to them and says, I'd like you to build me a website, or can you fix my car? The operations side of those businesses will say it will take X amount of time. It'll take X amount of time, and now we're going to assign that X amount of time to an employee. Do you know what I mean? So now you can measure their performance based on the allocation of time. So every business in its own way has to decide and work out for itself how to assess performance and how do we identify trends and how can we monitor it on a, you know, in a statistical way. There are all ways for all businesses. You know, manufacturing does that, don't they? That's the one thing that manufacturing do, is how can we make something in the quickest possible time? And in fact, the first ever HR module I did in university was about that, to illustrate that point, was how long does it take to do this? How long does it take to do that? How long, you know, add it all up, that's how long it should take to do from A to B. Therefore, you can measure people against that delivery. Right. So I think I mentioned this to you the other day, Jenny, actually, is about business planning. Is if I have a conversation with a client and I have this conversation in a similar way, and I'll ask them a question, do you have a business plan? Now, most of my clients will turn to me and say, of course I've got a business plan, Stuart. And I'll ask, where is it? I haven't seen it. Can you show it to me? Do you know what they do? When I ask them, where is your business plan? What do you think they do?
According to their ad, I would imagine.
It's right up here, mate, right up here. And the first thing I say is, well, it's no good there, mate, is it? There's absolutely no point your business plan being in your head, because nobody can get in your head. Nobody can read your mind. How can you tell people what it is you expect from them when you haven't documented and written it down? And so my debate, or my passing question, I guess, for all the participants in the webinar, is to think about what the business plan is for the next 1, 3, 5 years time. You know, what is the goal? It could be just to increase sales. It could be to open up a new office. It could be to, you know, maybe move into a different marketplace. It could be to introduce new products. You know, who knows what it could be? It could be to reduce overheads. Every business should have a business plan in line with that particular industry sector, whatever. And then what happens? Well, you might have a plan, but how are you going to achieve that plan? Well, you achieve your plan with staff, right? That's what they're there for. Staff is the biggest asset. So that business plan has to be broken down into goals for the various different parts of the business, whether it's departments, whether it's divisions, whether it's branches, locations, whether it's individuals. That business plan has to illustrate and demonstrate how those goals are going to be met. How are those targets going to be met? How can we hold people accountable for doing those things, so that if and when the business hits their goals, what happens next? And we go back to those 3 words, right? Expectations, accountability, and consequences. Those expectations start right at the top with the business plan. This is what we expect to have happen. Right, what have I got next? Mitigating the risk. That's what proactive HR is all about. Is, you know, if we've got a business plan and we want to get to the promised land, and this is the way we're going to do it, how can we make sure we do it at the lowest possible risk? And from a HR point of view, I'm not talking about health and safety, I'm not talking about finance, I'm just talking purely from a HR point of view. How can HR support the goals of the business? How can they support those targets that have been set in the business plan? How can we mitigate the risk? How can we make sure that the strategy, the communication lines, the management of staff, how can we make sure that all of those things are done so that we give operations and all the individuals the best possible chance they've got of doing the job that needs to be done? And there's a nice little picture. That's it, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Stuart. That was absolutely fascinating. Does anybody on the call have any questions? If you prefer to put them in the chat box, then you certainly can. I'm just monitoring the chat box now, Stuart, just to see if anyone has got any questions for you.
I can see, it's not a lot.
Or you can just unmute yourselves if you wish. They
haven't come off yet.
No. I'm just leaving it a bit longer because people mightn't be fast typists.
Yeah.
I don't want to cut anyone off if they're writing a complicated question.
No. Should we just talk amongst ourselves then?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it was. I do think the business planning element of it is fascinating. I think getting everybody involved to a point is quite helpful, but throughout, I kept thinking it's down to training. A lot of the time, it's down to training of managers, because you do end up becoming a manager, as you say, because you're the next in line. And it may be that the business has got a particular management or would like you to display a particular management style, and that may not be your natural management style. Do you feel that coaching can help you to change what would be your natural management style, or do you think that your natural management style is exactly that, and it's just a way of making it fit better?
You may be right, but I gave you, at the beginning, I gave 2 examples of 2 different industries, 2 different sectors, 2 different organizations, 2 different cultures, just 2 different everything. And I think, people can stay managers, but they've got to buy into what it is that the company wants from them. And that's why businesses have to decide what type of manager is it that we want. And certain industries might benefit. So I would think maybe like in a sales industry, you can start to imagine, in a way, you can start to see that in the sales industry, you may well be harsher, I guess, in the way. Oh, here's a question.
I've got an interesting question here. I have no authority in my banking institution to present a plan to employees, but how should you go about presenting a development plan to human resources?
I'd need to know a bit more, I think. So if Abigail, are you responsible for a department? Yeah. So if you're in a department and you want to make a presentation, I think firstly you go to your manager and get some buy-in from your manager and say, look, this is my department, this is what we're here to do, but I want to engage better with my staff. Are you okay if I put together a plan? Will you help me put together a plan? And then go and speak to HR as well. The thing is, though, I'd need to speak to you because I think every business is different and every HR department is different. I don't know how engaged your HR department is, whether there's a HR person who is on the board of directors. Is there a board of directors with a HR director on that board who can influence strategic thinking? Certainly when I worked in the NHS, the interesting thing in the NHS was that we didn't have a director of HR on the board of directors. We had a head of HR, and his job was to report to the director of finance. So now we don't have a strategic fan as such on the board. So each business is different, but certainly, and I've said this to a lot of managers that I work with my existing clients, if you want to introduce something, then put something forward to your line manager. and say, this is what I want to do, can we talk it through? And from there, once you've got that buy-in, you can go ahead and create a plan, or just create a plan and give it to them, say, I want to do this. I'm afraid I can't be more specific without knowing more about the environment that you operate in. But what was I saying previously, Jenny?
We were saying about the leadership style.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, you have things like personality profiling. You know, there are tools out there which can go some way to identifying the types of managers that we want to be in place to fulfill the particular roles that we want. You know, and also when you have, like, for example, some businesses will have teams, like, you know, team projects and things like that, you know, teams that do projects. And so under those circumstances, you would think that the personality profiling might help you identify which roles these people fulfill within the team. So, you know, like, was it Belbin? Belbin team roles, you know, he created all these different particular roles. You've got your thinker, your facilitator, your challenger, whatever. These are different people who fulfill very different roles within that team. Goes back to the same thing. Every business is different. There's a different set of agendas with a different structure. You know, a board of directors with 5 people has got a better chance of coming to an agreement when they can sort of bounce ideas off each other than a one man who is the MD, or one man who sits at the top and manages by dictatorship.
Yeah,
because I've seen that as well. I've seen dictatorship.
well,
And actually, in those environments, they find it very hard to delegate responsibility. They don't want to, because it's in their business, it's in their DNA. It's my business. I would do what I want to do, and you'll do it my way, or it's the highway. Well, your business isn't going to grow very far, is it really, if nobody feels they've got any influence over how the business evolves?
I think it depends. I have seen a business grow quite large with a management style that matched that, but I think that they were an exception to the rule in general, I would imagine, because I think that it would make for a less than pleasant culture, and depending on how many people you had within the sort of like the management team below the MD, I think, you know, it might depend. I mean, I think in this case it was mostly staffed by people who knew the MD, so they knew how he liked to operate. But I think if you brought a lot of external people in, that would have been difficult. I think it must be interesting to watch as a business grows, especially how they manage the culture when they recruit.
Absolutely. But not only that as well, but if a business is planning to evolve at some point, then the business owner it's got to have an exit plan, right? There has to be an exit strategy at some point. And if he's not prepared to hand over the business at some point to a delegate, then what's he doing? Well, there's got to be an exit plan at some point. And that's where I think, you know, certainly with small businesses, there has to be an understanding of what the overall strategy is. What is the exit plan? What is the business plan? And how do we get there? You know, I've met, I'd say half of my clients, I mean, I have to think about it actually, probably all of my, I'll say between half and 3/4 of my clients are all owner-led. So they're you know, they're the ones that set the business up. It's in their image. And I'm mindful of the fact that they would like to delegate to their managers, but they struggle to, because nobody can do the job quite like they can. And that's a challenge for them. And I ask them often, how many hours a week do you work? And you'd be amazed how many hours a week a lot of the owners actually work, because they haven't yet worked out, or they haven't yet been able to adopt a structure and a strategy that allows them to take a step back and delegate and just review and see it from afar, look at it from a distance. They're always too hands-on, too involved on a day-to-day basis. And I think, you know, my advice would be to take a step back, look at the bigger picture, and try and make sure that you've got all of your key positions managed by people who can do the job, and find out where the gaps are, and you know, try and create a plan.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult when it's a small business that's grown very rapidly, because you have to learn to delegate very quickly when that happens. If your business grows more slowly, you can delegate to one trusted person who then becomes someone that you can bounce ideas off before you delegate to a third person who then takes on some sort of specific responsibility, usually finance. And so it grows quietly and in a reasonable speed. But when you go from sort of 1 to 15 in
Yeah.
6 months, I think that's more of a challenge.
Absolutely. I had a client once who was in the printing industry, and he had, I think he had about 4 or 5 members of staff when I first started work with him, and then somehow he got a gig with Amazon. I couldn't believe it, but he got a gig with Amazon, and it doubled his turnover overnight. And within a fortnight, he'd hired another 6 members of staff. He was moving to bigger premises, and guess what happened then? They pulled the plug. Amazon went to another competitor, and he was left high and dry. But my view at the time was that he hadn't created the structure that could accommodate that level of growth, and that actually you need to create that structure that can absorb that level of growth. Because what would happen, you can think about a business where maybe you expanding growth, and now you're going to hire 6 new people to come in. Well, they're all newbies. They've all got to be trained from scratch. They're all new starters. That's not easy to hire 6 new people to come into a business which had 4 people, because they're now kicking their heels because there isn't a structure in place to manage their induction or manage their new role in the business.
Yeah, but it's chicken and the egg though, isn't it? Because if you land something like that, if you're a small business and you land something so big, it's not something that was necessarily in your business plan for that particular point. So it becomes reacting to the opportunity that has presented itself to you, which is a whole different issue than having a plan to take on board 3 new small-sized organizations as clients in year 1, and then in year 2 take on 6 new medium-sized ones, and to grow in that way. And there's a whole different issue if Amazon just drop a huge amount of work on you.
No, undoubtedly.
But then there's also the issue of the contracts as well, because if they've got the contracts, if you don't issue the contracts, I assume with one of these breakout clauses, so that they can layoff clause, then you're going to be up the proverbial without any sort of steering implement.
Absolutely. See, now you can see now how HR, like I think I said to you last week, you could probably take 10 people from the street, line them up and ask them what their view about HR is. They've probably got 10 different responses, and maybe most of them will say, well, that's recruitment, or I was recruited by a company, or I worked for a company once where there was a HR department and they sacked me. You might have a very negative view perhaps of what HR is. And certainly when I go networking and I tell people I work in HR, they sort of go, oh, that's I bet you've got some stories to tell. And I have, but I try and encourage people to say, yeah, but you're only referring to the times when I've had to react to problems in the workplace. HR should be supporting the growth. It should be supporting the structure and the flow of communication through the business. I shouldn't be a firefighter. If HR is firefighting, something's wrong.
Yeah, I strongly believe that HR need to have a seat at the top table, because your staff are your biggest single asset. They're also your most expensive asset, and sadly they're also the one asset that has got the biggest likelihood of being able to destroy your business in one sentence as well. So you need to have a seat. You need to have them have a seat at the table to ensure that is being managed appropriately, so that your people become your biggest asset as well as your biggest cheerleader.
Yeah,
because that's how your business grows. When all of your staff are cheerleaders for your business, then wherever they go, they're saying what a wonderful organization it is. And in doing so, the word of mouth work comes your way without you having to spend a lot on marketing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why I think the challenges for SMEs or small businesses is that if they are owner-led, they're unlikely to have HR at the top table. They're probably unlikely to have anybody else at the top table apart from themselves. You know, and that's
but a savvy small business with any number of with a small number of staff will have a HR consultant in the background who meets with them on a regular basis, even if the table really is only a coffee in Starbucks once a quarter. But it's still that input from an external organization that can see an overview of what's going on and the direction that you're going in because you're not too close to it, I think is hugely valuable, and allows you to have that access to that expertise without necessarily having to take somebody on a on a salary. And one of the biggest things that's come out of the pandemic, I think, has been the number of people that have discovered that they can do what they do for businesses other than the people they were originally employed by, and therefore allowing smaller businesses to have access to that level of expertise, what I've always called providing a champagne service on beer money, effectively. Because you couldn't have a Richard Branson style team. It would be very unaffordable to have a Richard Branson team in a small business. But a small business can have the best they can afford that's outsourced for the number of hours that they can afford to purchase it and make the most of that.
Absolutely.
I think we're getting to our time now, but it's been absolutely brilliant to speak with you about this. It's been absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us. Get the recording out to everybody in the next day or two, so that you've got that to look at. And may I also ask for the slides, Stuart, so that I can circulate the slides as well?
No worries.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.